So I'm going to talk today about the research we've been doing over the last decade with science teachers and trying to make science teaching more equitable and inclusive and socially just. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of talk, obviously, in the UK, and I'm guessing all over the world, about the gaps that have been emerging through COVID particularly, and a lot of concern about the lost learning. Well, that's how it's talked about over here. I think an important way that we can rethink about that more equitably, though, is to use the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talks about not saying we shouldn't talk about education gaps, but education debts, which is the idea that inequalities mean that some people are more disadvantaged than others by things, she wasn't talking about COVID, but by situations and contexts like that. And if we reframe it as a debt, it places a different emphasis. Rather than seeing learners as the deficit, the people who have lost learning, it talks about our responsibility as a society to repay that debt. So Gloria was talking a bit in the context of racialised inequalities, but I think it's a really useful concept that we can use to rethink education now. And I'd say it helps us also think that it's not only learning that we need to think about. And what I'm going to try and argue in this talk is the importance of putting ideas of equity and social justice at the heart of how we reimagine science education going forward. Next slide, please. So, as I'm sure you're very aware, there's been a huge amount of investment of time and resources over the years to try and increase and widen participation in science and STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths more broadly. But despite all of this work and all of these initiatives, the profile of who continues with science post-16 is still pretty white, male, middle class, able-bodied and so forth, quite privileged. A lot of the efforts that we've seen, and I'll talk about some of them later in my talk, I'm sure as teachers you probably have experienced a lot of them in your own professional lives, are quite often they're based on quite deficit models. So a lot of the science intervention work that we see in the UK is trying to raise young people's aspirations, or it's based on the idea that they lack interest, motivation, awareness or knowledge or whatever it is. But our research suggests that a lack of interest and motivation is not the main issue underpinning differences in science participation, and that school science education can both play an important role, an influential role in excluding and dissuading students from doing science, but it can also be part of the solution to that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk first about the work we've done on our Aspires project. Our Aspires project is now a 13-year longitudinal study. We've been tracking a cohort of young people in England from age 10 up to age 23. We just done most of the research with the qualitative sample at the age 21 last summer. And we've been picking them up at all these time points. It's a mixed method study. So we've done large scale surveys of over 40,000 young people to date. And we've got an in-depth sample of 50 young people and their parents who we've tracked from age 10 to 21 through over 700 interviews. Next slide, please. So this slide here gives you a little snapshot from our survey data. And you can see with the first cluster of columns, which is the example of whether young people agree they learn interesting things in science or not. You can see that each column represents different ages over time. And you can see that actually a high proportion of young people find science interesting at school. So you can see the first dark blue column in that first cluster is at the end of our primary school, age 10. And they are over 70%, through early secondary, over 70% of young people are finding science interesting. The purple column relate to when we have our national exams at 16. And I would say it's very hard to maintain interest in any subject in those years because it's really very much teaching to the test. But then, even then, nearly 60% of young people say they find science interesting. The last slightly lighter blue column is just students who select science after the age of 16. And unsurprisingly, they find it interesting, over nearly 90%. But that shows us that actually, generally, science is engaging. It's interesting young people. The next set of columns also show that generally their parents think it's important they learn science. So it's not that they lack home thinking it's important in that way, apart from when it's no longer compulsory, that last blue column there. It's also not that they have terrible stereotypes of scientists. So, for example, you can see in that third bunch of columns that they think scientists do valuable work. They also think they're quite well paid, they make a difference in the world. But all of these positive views of science don't translate into young people seeing science as something that could be for me in my future. So you can see there that last bunch of bar graph columns is very low, and that's who aspires to be a scientist, to do a science job in the future. And you can see that proportionally that's very low compared to all the other high columns. So we're interested in what makes this difference between enjoying doing science and wanting to be a scientist. And although that little set of columns under aspire to be a scientist looks like it varies, bobbles around, statistically there's no difference there. So statistically, this proportion of young people who aspire to be a scientist at age 10 is pretty much the same number who aspire at age 18. And that doesn't change much. So we're not doing anything to change it. What does happen is the profile of who is within that grouping of aspiring to be a scientist becomes more socially narrow. So schools aren't opening up ideas about being a scientist, they're closing them down or not making a lot of difference. Next slide, please. So just to put science aspirations in context with other jobs, you might not be able to read the words on this screen, it's very small, but you can see there, thank you, that scientist is quite low compared to lots of other jobs. So this is students at age 15, 16 as an example, but it's not much different between different age groups. And the most popular aspiration here is business. And you can see that scientist is much lower than that. Celebrity is the fourth one as well, which always feels slightly depressing. But business is also our most mixed aspiration. It has the best gender, ethnic and class mix of young people aspiring to it. Whereas scientist, it's predominant, and engineer, which is also there, is predominantly more affluent white and South Asian boys, more likely to be there. So we're interested in what is it that makes business feel open and something that anyone can do, whereas scientist feels like a very specialist occupation or route. Next slide, please. So in our Aspire study, we've tried to map out all these factors, all the things that make a difference to what makes a young person, what affects the likelihood of a young person developing a science identity and a science aspiration. Now you can see from this graphic that if nothing else, it tells us that it is very complex. There is no one factor. There are lots of interconnecting factors that make a difference. And this is also why it's quite hard to make a difference to. So the things affecting whether a young person feels that science is for me and something I can aspire to in the centre there are all these things, all these factors wrapped around it. So I'm going to talk through a couple of them in terms of these colour groupings. And there's a link to our report if you'd like to read more. So next slide, please. So the first set of groupings, the purple factors, all relate to schools. Now, some of these might be quite particular in England, but there may be aspects of it which resonate in other contexts. So in England, our system tries very hard to stop young people from continuing with science. We stream them onto different routes from a very early age. From about age 13, 14, we commonly put about 75% of young people on what's called the less prestigious double route, and about 25% of people go on the more high status triple route, which can lead to post-16 science more easily. We also have very strange practices, like for some reason we mark advanced level physics and chemistry papers harder than other subjects. So it is harder to get a top grade, which then translates into schools restricting entry to those subjects. So although the particularities may be different in other nations, the idea of science being elite and only for the cleverest can often be worked through, as in this example from England, through the kinds of practices and gatekeeping that we set up within education systems. Next slide, please. This also relates to these ideas with the bottom green set of factors on the diagram, of the ideas, popular ideas of science as being only for clever and male students. So young people learn from a very young age that science, but particularly physics is only for the select male brainy few. In our sample, we found lots of sad examples of young people telling us that their teachers were constantly telling them science is difficult, you have to try really hard. We had young women telling us that their teachers had told them, you need a boy brain to study maths or physics, or all my tomboyish girls study physics. And this was even in quite progressive girls' science-focused schools that we found this. So it happens everywhere. There was also differential support. Boys and students from more affluent social backgrounds were statistically more likely to say they received encouragement from their teachers to continue with science. And we'd say over time, what we call pedagogic work, which is a concept from Bourdieu's sociology, produces these ideas of who science is for, and it makes young people more likely to go down particular routes or to see it as not for them. So next slide, please. So this next slide just exemplifies that. So Victor is one of the young people in our study. He actually went on to take an astrophysics degree, but his interviews show this quite clearly. So in primary, which was year 6, when he was age 10, like most of the young people in our study, he said, you don't have to be clever to do science, you just have to want to do it. It's a nice, open, meritocratic idea. By the time he got to secondary, you can see there at year 8, he says, I think you have to be a little bit clever. Yeah, you have to be quite clever. The year after, by year 9, people keen on science, they're not average people. They're more cleverer than most people. And by the time he was 15, 16, yeah, you have to be clever to study science. So he's quite typical of our sample here, but what strikes us is that these ideas solidify over time between different schools. He changes school from primary to secondary, between different teachers, different curricula, different examinations. But all of his experiences together combine to reinforce over time this idea that physics and science, you have to be clever to do it. Next slide, please. So the problem with this is that being able to see yourself as clever enough to do physics can be very much affected by things like gender, race and class. So that some young people, it's not related to their attainment so much, but they may be less likely to see themselves and to be recognised by others as living up to that impossible stereotype. So there's an example here from Kate. Now Kate took advanced level physics, and you can see here when I asked her in an interview, do you think you'd do physics at university? She said, well, I think I've always liked physics, but I've always thought it'd be quite hard, so maybe not for me. I wouldn't do a straight physics degree because it would be too hard. I'm just a bit put off thinking it'd be really hard. So you can tell Kate is worried about taking physics, not because she doesn't find it interesting, she really likes physics, because she worries it's too hard. But Kate was our highest achieving student in the whole sample. She had the top marks across the board in every subject. So I said to her, but if you can't do it, who can? So the point here is the idea of physics as being clever and male is not related to how well you actually do in your attainment, but to have the distance between how you see that stereotype and see yourself or as seen by others. Next slide, please. As a result, we found that many, even very highly interested and high attaining students, were reluctant to pursue science and would self-exclude. So this idea that science is interesting, but it's not for me. And all of these practices, the gatekeeping practices, the ideas for it being for brainy, clever people, all work to create this. And it also leads to a cultivation of stereotypical views of science and scientists among those who do continue. So when we looked at our survey data for the age 17-18, we found that the students in our sample who were the most likely statistically to express stereotypical views of scientists as odd, male and geeky were our A-level physics students. A bit like the Sheldon effect, Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, just illustrating it for us there. And in turn, we would question whether those students are the most likely to be able to help dismantle those stereotypes in the future. Next slide, please. So the final group of factors in our model relate to what we call capital, and particularly the idea of science capital. So science capital is an idea that we developed in the Aspires project and we've extended since. And it can kind of be thought of a bit like just a conceptual holdall or bag for bringing together all your science-related knowledge, skills, understanding, behaviours, social contacts, and so on. And we found that students whose science capital was valued within schools were more likely to aspire to and participate in post-16 science and have a science identity. So you could say the more science capital they had, the more likely they were to continue. Next slide, please. So science capital, when we try and break it down statistically, groups into 4 main areas, or if you like the bag analogy, pockets. So the first is science literacy, what science you know. Then we have your science-related attitudes and values, how you think about science, what you do in your spare time, and who you know at home and the amount of encouragement you receive. And we've got some little animated videos and things, which just short ones that just explain it on the link if you're interested. Next slide, please. And we found that it's this combination of science capital and the extent to which it's recognised or not in a school setting that helps produce this idea of whether science is for me or not. So we use the terms with care, but the idea of if you think of families with more or less science capital, they're just exemplified here. So the first 2 quotes are from what we could call high science capital families. So we've got the mum saying, the other day in the car we were laughing about chemical symbols and things. So I guess it comes into discussion quite subliminally. And Davina says, science just where it's at in my family. She talks about how they sit around the table wearing their science t-shirts, talking about what they've read in science magazines and so on. But they're not the usual. They're the top 5% of our sample. More likely are the quotes like the other mother, they're saying, I suppose in everyday life you just don't get that much to do with science. Or my family never talk about science. Next slide, please. So we tried to bring all of these insights together and say, well, is there anything we can do about it? Is it fixed or can we change things? So we've worked over a number of years now with teachers to co-develop what we call the science capital teaching approach. And it has 2 elements to it. There's the idea of how you get a social justice mindset and then how you apply that to practice. And key to all of this is the idea that we're trying to change practice, or often what we call the field, and not the young person. So this differs to a lot of interventions which try and change the young person in some way, whereas we're suggesting it's the context which young people are in. If we can change that and the way they encounter science, that will allow them to more meaningfully connect and engage. And key to this is understanding, taking what we call a social justice mindset. Next slide, please. So we're very aware that this is quite an abstract concept in a way. So we've worked with practitioners across our projects to try and develop a simple tool, a reflective tool for helping understand what does it mean to take a social justice approach in my teaching or in my work. And the equity compass here is really a reflective tool. It specifies 8 dimensions that you might want to think about if you want to think about equity in your practice, and it has a set of reflective questions and you can kind of map where you are on it. And the idea is that the centre is not equitable and you're trying to move outwards on all the different dimensions. So next slide, please. So these will be too small to read probably, but the idea is that it helps us think about different dimensions like power. To what extent are we reinforcing, for instance, ideas of scientists as white men? Or to what point are we disrupting or transforming those? So the further out you go, the more equitable the practice. If you look at the green one there, it's also about thinking like how participatory are we? Are we doing science to young people? Are we doing it for them? Or are we doing it with them? The bottom orange one, how central are equity issues in what we're teaching? Are they quite minor, tokenistic? Or are they major? Are they part of or are they embedded through everything that we're doing? And so on. Next slide, please. So the idea is that these 8 dimensions can help us just reflect on our practice and come up with ideas for how to try and make it more equitable. So moving from inside to out. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And there's just a little example here of how we've worked with it in practice. So This example is from a primary school class that had a professional engineer. We'll call him Dr. Bridges. This isn't him. This is an image from Google, but it tells you a bit about who he was. And he came in to tell children about bridges, and they did a lolly stick bridge building challenge. This is very typical in the UK. And they're basically learning that arched bridges are stronger than flat bridges, and they put toy cars on it to see how it works. So if we have the next slide, please. If we use the compass, we could say that, well, obviously there was good things about what he did. It was a break from the norm. The children did learn that arched bridges are stronger than flat bridges. They got to meet a STEM professional. Most of them had never met an engineer. So there were useful things about it. But if we use the compass, we can actually see that it wasn't really disrupting or challenging any dominant ideas or stereotypes about engineers and engineering, and it didn't support the children's agency. And they weren't massively engaged or inspired. There's a couple of quotes there afterwards. So one of the children saying, "I think an engineer is a man who's good at maths and science, needs to be strong and make stuff." And the other two were saying, "He's obsessed with bridges. He just really loved bridges." And to be fair, he did. He did really like bridges, and he conveyed that passion. But as the last quote says, "It was okay, I guess, but I'm not the most massive fan of bridges." He didn't manage to really engage and connect with the majority of the children. Next slide, please. So if we were using the compass, we'd map Dr. Bridges' session, and it would kind of sit near the middle. And we'd suggest that there are things that he could do to tweak his session to improve its inclusivity. Next slide, please. So, for example, he could draw more on the existing knowledge and interests of the young people in the class. What did they know and care about? What engineering things would they want to build? He could have made it a bit more participatory. He can't change who he is, but he could have actually brought equity issues in a bit more of a meaningful way. He could have shown pictures of other engineers. He could have talked about all the different issues around the world that engineering can try and challenge or help with. What do the young people care about? And in particular, we'd encourage him to think about engineering as a vehicle rather than a destination. So a lot of these sorts of intervention come in with the premise that we want to get more young people into engineering. And we'd say you could flip that and say, how can engineering play a part in the young people achieving what they want to get achieved in life? Next slide, please. So if you're interested, we have little 2-minute animations, we've got supporting documents and so on. Next slide, please. And then we integrate this idea of the social justice mindset with what we call the science capital teaching approach. So this is a way that it works with any curriculum that we've co-developed with teachers over the last 6 years, which is a way of trying to meaningfully connect young people with science through everyday science teaching. It's again a mindset, a reflective framework, and we've empirically tested it over the years. Next slide, please. So we've developed it, as I said, with over 40 teachers over 4 years, and currently we're working in secondary and we're currently working in primary. And next slide, please. I'm just aware of time, so I'll try and skip over. But in a nutshell, this is the model. This is actually the primary phrasing of the model, but it applies across the board. And the idea is that it's a reflective practice model. You reflect and then tweak your practice. It's built on the bedrock of good science teaching. But then it has these foundations and these pillars of practice, which teachers have co-developed with us to try and help pull out the ways we can embed that equitable mindset. So next slide, please. So the foundation is built on trying to broaden what we understand and experience as being science in the classroom. So it's the idea that students don't just find the content and ideas of science difficult. For some of them, it feels really alien and just not connected to their lives. So it's very much trying to challenge those ideas I talked about earlier about science being for the brainiest, and challenging ideas of what counts as being, what gets recognised as being a good student, a science student in lessons. Next slide, please. There are 4 aspects of the foundation, which I won't talk through in detail, but if you're interested, you're very welcome. All our things are free to, all our resources are free to access. But it's around tailoring to the least engaged, starting very child-centric, starting with the student, levelling the playing field, and supporting students' voice and agency. Next slide, please. We then have these pillars of practice, which teachers have developed as a way of The first one is personalising and localising science, which goes beyond contextualising science. In England, teachers are great at contextualising science, but our teachers wanted to take this further and really tailor their content to the actual young people in their lives. And there's just a quote there from one of our teachers talking about how that when they were able to do this, they found the young people were much more excited when it's something connected to something they've experienced, which they personally care about. Next slide, please. Our teachers then also use this technique of eliciting what students know already, valuing that, and then linking to the science content and extending beyond. So it's very much about the idea that it's trying to challenge that idea of that students don't know anything about science, they just need to be taught stuff, that they're the novices. This starts with valuing what they already know that may link to science, bringing that into the lesson and then building on that. Next slide, please. And then the final pillar is about specifically trying to support the different science capital dimensions. So, for example, using homeworks to support science discussions at home, helping young people to engage more with science as a sort of cultural activity through media and so on. And particularly understanding the idea that science is useful for everything. It's not just a qualification to becoming a scientist, that science knowledge and skills are relevant for all of life. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we've trialled it over the years in secondary, and we're currently working with primary. It has been slightly impacted by COVID, but our teachers have been doing a fantastic job, and they've been applying it both in their classrooms when they've been in their classrooms and also through their virtual teaching too, which has been really exciting. We know from the secondary trials that this resulted in significant increases in students' science capital, their engagement, their participation in lessons and so on. And all our primary teachers are similarly reporting positive changes, particularly among the unengaged students and those who are in our bottom sets where we set in secondary. And as one of our primary teachers told us, what they found by applying the approach over a whole year was that they moved from what they called golden moments, what some of our other teachers called meerkat moments. When they use the approach, the students kind of sit up and it resonates and they feel, wow, okay, I know something about that. That connects to something in my life, through to what Mrs. Richards there called a golden haze. So the whole culture of her class changed. For her, she started with a age 10, 11 class, year 6 in primary. She said she really didn't, at the start of the year, she really didn't enjoy teaching this class. She used to dread it. And then over time, using the approach, they actually began to engage. The whole culture and the way they engaged is much more inclusive. And she talked about feeling there was a golden haze in that class by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So to sum up, I'm arguing that we think foregrounding issues of equity and social justice within science teaching can be really important, really valuable and productive. In England, at least, our teachers' equity issues are a tiny part of initial teacher education, if that. And we think teachers just deserve more time and support to engage with these ideas and concepts because they're not simplistic, we don't all know it. We suggest that small changes can make a difference, but they need to be incorporated into standard practice. So in the UK, we're advocating a shift away from these kind of funders funding these big one-off events with young people to try and engage them with science, and shifting to more supporting teachers in their everyday practice and working longer term in a more in-depth way. As I've said, our focus is very much on changing practice and not changing the young person. And as I said earlier, for us, it's really important to understand it's not just what you do, it's not the tasks or the activities per se, but the way you do it, the values and the mindset you bring to that. So as I've mentioned, the primary work, we've already got secondary handbooks for teachers. We've got a new primary handbook and resources coming later this year in September, October, which again will be freely available. And next slide, please. There's more details on any of our projects if you're interested in them. And I think the final slide at the end is just if we move on one slide. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing and answering any questions. Thank you.
So much, Louise. It's fantastic. Very important work you've done here. So I have a lot of questions, and to all you audience out there, please ask some questions. We have about 15 minutes So please ask some questions for Louise. I have a few here already. I have to look at the right angle here. So the first question here is, could this difficulty in science be linked to problems of understanding math?
It's a good question, thank you. Yes, I think obviously maths is closely related to science, as we all know. And when students, particularly in, for example, in physics, I mean, all of the science, but we know as the higher up you go, if you're struggling with maths, you will also have those issues with science. But for us, it's not just a content knowledge issue, because as you saw with the example with Kate was fantastic. She got top marks in maths, she got top marks in physics. For her, the level of attainment and understanding was not the key issue. It was feeling that she didn't measure up to this quite impossible stereotype. So we would say underneath it, well, we're not saying that it's not important for students to be able to learn maths. Actually, beyond that, even if you sort that, there's still this distance, this disconnect between many students and science. And that's what we're trying to help tackle in our project. And we've also found that when we close that distance, when, for example, in the secondary trial, when young people felt more connected, they felt that understanding and resonance with science, they got the examples, they made sense to them, it actually increased their understanding and attainment. They were actually able to take on board the content, information and knowledge and skills better, and they actually achieved better. So we think getting this bedrock foundation right can support other forms of understanding as well. So it all plays a part.
Thank you so much. The next question here is, do you think Science Capital and the Science Capital teaching approach will apply to the Danish education system or other education systems in Scandinavia?
Thank you, and a really good question. So we always say that with any of our approaches, they have to be locally developed and owned. We don't believe that you can pick up one practice and just plonk it down in another context and it will work exactly. There needs to be tailoring. But we have worked with a number of other countries, and they're telling us that they find that it does have resonance. So it's been translated into other languages, and we worked with teachers in Malta, for instance. I think Norway have translated it, and so Norway, we're working with some of these ideas as well. It's in Welsh as well. Wales has a slightly different education system to us. So yes, we hope the ideas have resonance, but we also would look forward to people taking them up and making them fit their context.
Yeah, and according to the number of people I've talked with was interested in your work, I think it'll be coming to Denmark quite soon.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Another question, we actually have quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just jump right to the next one. You said that business education seemed more open than science education. Isn't it just a matter of what is prestigious or what as occupation?
Yes, I think part of the thing with business is that it could be anything. It could be working for a top multinational company, it could be owning your own hairdressing business. So part of what's attractive about business is the fact young people can imagine themselves into it in lots of different ways. And I think that has an interesting message for science, because I think currently we present science careers in a very narrow way. It's all about becoming a scientist or a different sort of scientist. So we'll differentiate all different STEM areas, but what we're not telling young people so much is that whatever you want to be, science skills and knowledge are useful for everything. So, you know, being able to analyse data, develop arguments, treat, measure, do things critically, that's useful for everything. And I think we need to stop trying to sell particular science careers to young people and start talking about the translational nature of science.
Thank you. So then next, I'll jump right to the next question. So could you broaden out the things you said about big science events in relations to daily work?
Yes, so in the UK, we find that a lot of the way that whether it's charities or professional societies or industry, a lot of the ways they try and support and get more and more diverse young people into science is through quite often quite one-off events. So we have the Big Bang Fair in the UK, and lots of stalls, young people would go to that. It tends to be one day. Or we have a STEM ambassador scheme where representatives from industry would go and visit a school like Dr. Bridges, tell them about their work. These are all useful. They're all part of the ecosystem. But we think there's too much emphasis on one-offs, because we know from our longitudinal study that the impact of a one-off event cannot continue. We can't expect it to continue over time. It's simply, there's so many things in young people's lives that it may inspire them for a little bit, but what they need, what we find when we analyse who continues with science, is this wraparound. So a constant reinforcement of different support over time, over context, in different ways that helps keep them, support them on their STEM trajectories. So if we only have one-off events, they're like a firework. They are bright, they explode, they're exciting, but then they fade away. We need things that also continue longer over time, particularly for young people from underrepresented communities who need more support more often, more consistently.
Thank you. Next question here is, I guess that that teachers' bias is a factor in changing towards a more science capital-oriented science education. Who has the project worked with? Has the project worked with teachers' bias?
Yes, so we found this was a really key part of the co-development work we did with teachers. When we developed the secondary approach, we had a range of teachers. Some of them volunteered and some of them were volunteered by their schools. So we had a range of people whose practice was either more similar or more different to the approach. The people whose practice was more similar, they kind of picked it up quicker, it resonated quicker, they got going quicker with it. Some teachers were quite sceptical at the start, and it was quite new, but we found that the thing that made the difference was once they tried it out, and quite soon they could see a difference in those young people in their class who didn't normally engage. That's when they bought into it, and that's when they became more excited about it, and they adopted it more. So I agree, for some people it can be a longer, a slightly more involved process of getting to grips with it.
So they have to get used to it.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair to teachers, in England, we don't, their initial teacher education, we have so little in that on issues of equity. And we know, as I said about the example from the A-level physics students being more stereotypical in their views of scientists, science teachers will have gone through a science degree and been cultivated, socialised into the eliteness of science. So in a sense, they're coming from having a harder starting position than if you've done a sociology degree, for instance, where you've completely engaged with issues of inequality. So part of our messages are to initial teacher education to say, this is really important. We need to support science teachers with this properly, both initially and through their continuing practice. We need to value this and give people time and space to be able to engage with it and reflect.
I think that actually the next question is a bit, coupled to that. It's about challenges. Is it mainly implementing it in the classroom, or is it the curriculum that's the problem?
I think curriculum does play a part. So we were very pragmatic. We wanted an approach that would work with any curriculum, because we realised you can't, in the UK, you just can't bring in a new curriculum from nowhere. And some curricula that teachers were working with were closer to our approach than others. But I think, so I agree, we're working at the moment liaising with one of the curriculum providers to work out how to embed the approach more into the curriculum so the two can work together more. But I do think, particularly in the UK, we need to look at how we formulate curriculum. It tends to be quite top-down often. And I think there's much more scope to build these ideas in. And I think when they can be built in, it just works much more seamlessly. It just links together better.
So next question, we don't have that much time, so it's next question here: is it a goal for schools to produce more scientists, or how does it? Okay. Or how does the proportions of young people who aspire to science compare with the proportions of jobs in science in the society? Did you get the question?
Good question.
I just had to
yes,
switch microphone.
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's a good question. Thank you. So in the UK, we have a predicted STEM skills gap one already and growing. So there's a lot of concern, for example, that we don't have enough young people with engineering skills to meet the demands of the economy and wanting to keep competitive in the world, and to solve the issues facing society around climate change and food and all sorts, water. So I think that is important, but our project also comes from the point of view that it's not just about the pipeline. For us, a scientifically literate, active citizenship is really important. So we're saying for the world, for people to be able to make informed decisions about their health, for instance, being vaccinated, are big debates at the moment. All of these things, protecting the environment, we need scientifically literate young people who can use science to make a difference in the world. So for us, it's not just about the pipeline and the economy at all. It's much, much bigger than that.
Thank you. Next question: how do you think schools can best support teachers in developing skills that will make science teaching more equitable in the way you envision? Did you get the question?
Yes.
I'm
yes,
sorry, it's
you.
a bit difficult to.
No, that's very good. So I think it's difficult. I think schools, I think setting up valuing reflective practice and supporting teachers, whether it's within science departments, just to have that time, using staff meetings, and we call them inset days, like professional development days, to be able to engage with these ideas and discuss them. We have, all our resources are free to use, so we often suggest that schools can start with those and just have time to engage with it and discuss and think about how they would then apply it to practice and support one another. We found in our trials where teachers work together, not just on their own, it was additionally powerful. It's always nice when they were co-planning lessons together, or just that 5-minute chat. Our teachers often tell us it's having a colleague to have a 5-minute chat in the corridor with about what they've tried out, what they found, ideas together. Our teachers were telling us they came up with ideas for how to use the approach in their classes that they would never have come up with on their own when they talked to colleagues. So I think that collective culture, time is the main thing. I think if nothing else, our projects have given teachers time to reflect, and that's often just really valuable in practice. Teachers never get given enough time.
That's true. So a question about what to do when you teach. Do you think we need to present more theory and do more and less theory and more laboratory work and outdoor teaching in order to exercise the social justice approach in our teaching?
Yeah, another great question. So I think all of those things are good. I'd come back to my original point of it's not just what you do, it's the values that drive what you do. So it's not just doing, like, I believe practical work's really important and valuable and we should be doing more. In England, it's been taken away a lot. I think that's important because science is about doing practical work, having practical skills as well. But it's not just doing those. I think it's having that mindset for thinking about what you do. And often for our teachers, we say, just stop and think when you're about to teach a lesson, rather than thinking, I need to teach this content because it's on the curriculum, they need to understand X, Y, Z. Think, why should they care about this? How would this connect to the young people's lives? What might they know already about this? And just that start, it's very simple. I mean, it's based on good practice anyway, it's sort of good child-centered teaching, but starting with the young person and thinking, why do they need to know this? Why should they care? And what do they already know? Can be just a nice way to gently start engaging with the approach and to slightly flip it.
Thank you. We have just 30 seconds for the last question here, and it's about the status of different jobs in science. Does that affect school kids and their choice and their view in science in school?
Yeah, I think so, and it affects different children in different ways. I think for me, a lot of the issues underlying participation inequalities in science are due to the elite status of science. We always talk about equity as not a zero-sum game. So we can't keep science elite and just broaden participation and leave science unchanged. For us, fundamentally, you have to think about challenging privilege and making it more democratic and less elite, less special, in order to meaningfully broaden participation and have more inclusive and equitable science cultures. So I think for us, that is the status of science and jobs is, although it may attract some people, it's actually part of the problem, and we need to start recognising or conveying how, for example, physics is no difficult or more elite than any of the other sciences. But that is sometimes a hard message for physicists because they enjoy the eliteness.
That's true. Thank you so much, Louise. We're sorry we've run out of time. There's many more questions, but I think that hearing this is fantastic, and thank you so much. We'll be able to see this presentation again, and I guess we'll get your slides available.
Yes, you're very welcome to that.
Asked about it. Thank you so much.